The week that usually what I do is I prepare these sermons weeks out, and on Tuesdays most of the time I'll spend the day kind of really digging into the research of the sermon, and on the night before I'll usually kind of read the passage just to kind of get a feel for it, to kind of know what I'm up against the next day. And the night that I was doing, or the day that I was doing chapter 17, the night before, I brought this passage to the dinner table, and I said, you guys have got to see what we're going to be talking about in a few weeks. And as I read this passage, I could barely get the words out because it's certainly PG-13 at best, and parts of this probably would, because of the violence, would step into the R realm. So just warning you this morning as we get into this chapter this morning. But the cool thing is, if we can take these images as graphic as they are, and we can understand them and understand what God is saying through these images, the symbolism has incredible power to reveal God's truth to us. Now, each week we've taken just a moment to recall where we've been. We're so far into the story now. And by the way, as we are heading into Advent, Advent is 3 weeks from today. The beginning of Advent is December the 1st. We're going to be in Revelation, and we're going to be finishing Revelation. And I'll tell you, these chapters toward the end of Revelation are glorious. And it'll make these chapters, the ones we're dealing with today, worth it when we get to the end. I can promise you that. And Advent is really anticipation, not just of Jesus' first coming, but also his second coming. So it'll be very appropriate that we be in those last few chapters of Revelation. Now, it'd be impossible to go all the way back to the beginning, but let me remind you of where we are, and just in case it's your first time with us in this series, kind of pull you into the story. John is recording this vision for us. And again, he's at the end of the first century, and what he is seeing in this vision is beyond our comprehension, beyond our frame of reference. And so when he writes it down, he writes it in this apocalyptic genre. And as we understand this genre, we understand that there are symbols, there are images here that communicate to us truths that we could not understand apart from these images, really greater truths. And he's told, write this down in this apocalyptic genre and distribute it to 7 churches in Asia Minor. And so that's what he does. And so we understand that how the Christians are living and the dynamics of what's happening in the first century certainly play into how we interpret this book. And so that's 2 things we've got to understand: apocalyptic genre, and we've got to understand that John is writing primarily to the churches in the first century, although the message of what he's writing is really for all times and for all Christians. So the images that we have so far: we have a pregnant woman, we have a dragon, we have a beast, we have a lamb. Last week we talked about angels holding bowls and pouring these bowls out on the world. You see, again, images. Allow me to set the stage for what's happening here. A dragon, who represents the evil one, has been pursuing a pregnant woman who represents the people of God, waiting to give birth to the Messiah. Now, the dragon really wants to take out this child of the pregnant woman, who is the Messiah, but we read that that child is taken up into heaven before the dragon is able to do that. And we understand the child is Jesus, and his life and his death, his resurrection, and his ascension into heaven is a part of the story. So the dragon's mad now, and the dragon goes after the offspring of the child. That's you and me. That's Christians, right? Those who are followers of the Lamb. And all the while, the dragon is empowering these beasts or these monsters who unleash evil on the world. And at the same time, the followers of the Lamb are remaining faithful and true to him. That's the big picture, if you want to kind of use that to kind of wrap our minds around what we're reading this morning. So here we come to chapter 17 together this morning. I'm going to ask Jenna Abraham to come and read for us this morning. And she's going to read the first 8 verses. And as you follow along in your Bibles, and then she's going to come back in a few minutes and read the rest of the chapter.
Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman, drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come."
All right. Thank you, Jenna. Now, I told you this was PG-13 at best, right? When I was putting this down and I was writing this sermon, I was using the NTE version, and the NTE version translates the word prostitute as whore. And I had that as the title of a sermon, and Levi said, "Dad, you can't do that. You can't put that in there." So I changed it back to prostitute. Maybe that's a more sanitized version, right? But back in chapter 16, John witnessed 7 angels and 7 bowls. And so one of these angels here in verse 1 comes and gets John and says, "Come with me. I want to show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters." Now, we read this chapter. Let me point you ahead in the story, because I think this helps us understand this chapter. Look with me at Revelation 21. I'll put this verse on the screen for you to see. This is toward the end of the story. And again, this helps us understand what we're seeing here. The same angel that reveals to John in chapter 21, notice what it says in chapter 21, verse 9. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls of the 7 last plagues came and said to me, again, same angel, "Come, I will show you" what? The bride, the wife of the Lamb. So it's no coincidence, is it, that the same angel is showing John both images, a prostitute and a bride. 2 images for us to hold in our minds. Now, these images are not used solely in Revelation. In fact, they are used throughout the Bible. I want to show you some other passages all the way back in Isaiah. Isaiah says this, "See how the faithful city has become a harlot." He's talking about the people of God here. "She once was full of justice, righteousness used to dwell in her, but now murderers." Jeremiah, in more than one place, speaks of Israel as a prostitute. He says in chapter 13, verse 27, "Your adulteries and lustful neighings, your shameless prostitution, I have seen your detestable acts on the hills and in the fields. Woe to you, O Jerusalem! How long will you be unclean?" So this image of a prostitute is used throughout the Bible. But this prostitute is described as sitting on many waters. What's all that about, right? What does sitting on many waters mean? Now, if you go ahead to verse 15, you'll see that the angel is going to explain this to John. And he says that the many waters means peoples and multitudes, nations and languages. That's what many waters means. And we actually see this phrase back in Jeremiah 51. Look at this scripture. Jeremiah says this, speaking of Babylon. He says, "You who live by many waters," there's that phrase, "and are rich in treasures, your end has come, the time for you to be cut off." So that reference, many waters, really just means a multitude of languages and peoples and nations. This prostitute is not just in one place, affecting one particular city. Her reach and her realm is far and wide. And in the first century, we know that Babylon The symbolic city is Rome in the first century. We'll keep going here. Look at verse 2. She's described as committing adultery with the kings of the earth. Verse 2, with her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Now, again, we're not talking about a literal prostitute going around and committing adultery with all of these kings. It's a symbolism here, and it's imagery to help us understand. Now, Babylon and Rome are the images that we are understanding as these great evil empires. They're certainly prosperous places, but their prosperity was built on evil. In fact, social and economic oppression were fueling the success of these places, these civilizations. And they had all of the characteristics of evil. Power. They were powerful. You didn't mess with Rome. If you did, you're going to be in trouble, right? Money, wealth, and riches. The trade routes that ran throughout the Roman Empire were some of the most impressive of the day and provided for the citizens in the Roman Empire all that they could ever want and need. And sex. Power, money, sex. Illicit sex was a primary thing that happened in the Roman Empire. In fact, most of the pagan worship revolved around prostitution and that sort of thing. The description here also says that the people were intoxicated on the wine of her adulteries. Now, what does that mean? Now, think about wine for a moment. When you drink wine, it overtakes you, doesn't it? When you drink wine, it overwhelms you. And sometimes if you drink too much wine, you lose control. And that's what's going on here. The evil one, represented here as a prostitute, everybody's drunk on her wine. Everybody's living in a way, they're not thinking about what they're doing. They're just going with the flow, enjoying the success, enjoying the evils. Jeremiah describes Babylon. Look at what Jeremiah says. Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk. Sounds a lot like what John is saying here. The nations drank her wine, therefore they have now gone mad. Do you see how the Bible uses the imagery of wine to describe, again, not literal wine here, but how evil makes its way into our world? And people aren't really thinking about what they're doing anymore. They're just doing it. They're drunk on the wine of the prostitute. Let's keep going in Jeremiah's description here. John is carried away in the Spirit in verse 3. It's worth noting that 4 different times in the book of Revelation, John describes his experience as being carried away in the Spirit. And where does he go? He goes into the wilderness, into the desert, some translations say. Now, in the Bible, the desert is a place of difficulty sometimes, right? Jesus goes into the desert to face Satan. It's also a place where God's people were rescued out, but this wilderness. So John is taken into the wilderness in the Spirit here, and it says he sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, this just gets weird, doesn't it, as we start reading it. John sees this woman now in a different light. At first, she was sitting on many waters, but now she is sitting on this beast. And what color is the beast? The beast is red or scarlet. That is the color of evil. Every time you see someone dressed up like a devil, he's always red, right? Unless you're a duke and then you're a blue devil. I don't really understand that one. But the devil is often pictured as red. Evil is the color, or red is the color of evil. Terrifying color. It's a striking color, isn't it? We might imagine these blasphemous names covering the body. What are the blasphemous names? Some have pictured these names as the names of the Roman emperors who claimed to be God, and perhaps that's what John is seeing there. Look at how the beast compares to the beast in Revelation chapter 13. This is a few chapters ago. John sees the dragon standing on the shore of the sea, and there he sees the beast coming out of the sea. And it says there, the beast had what? 10 horns and 7 heads, 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. So it sounds a lot like this description, doesn't it? 7 heads, 10 horns. Now, we could get into what this is going to mean, or we could talk about this now, but we'll talk about it in a few minutes because the angel actually gives John some clue as to what this means. It's also worth noting that in Daniel chapter 7, if you go there and you read of the beast there, he also has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, look at how the woman is dressed here in verse 4. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet. She was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She had a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. Now, purple was the expensive color of a garment. It was hard to make a purple garment because you had to get the dye just right, and the dye was a rare sort of dye, so it was costly. Think of the most costly clothes in our society today. What store would you go to if you really wanted to spend a lot of money? I mean, whatever that is. That's the kind of clothes that she's wearing. She's wearing the rich clothes. She is adorned with jewels and pearls. Now, it's worth comparing how the prostitute is dressed in this image with how the bride is dressed in chapter 19. Look at this verse. Fine linen, bright and clean, were given her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the saints. So again, the prostitute dressed in purple with lots of jewelry and gold, and the bride dressed in white. Those are the two images that we have. These images help us see and understand God's kingdom, don't they? The forces at work in our world even today. Even today, we have the prostitute and the bride. We have one way that seems attractive for a moment, and then we have the other way that's attractive for a lifetime. We have false intimacy, a prostitute, and we have true intimacy, a bride. These two images standing in contrast to one another. Now, look at verse 5. The title was written on her forehead. Now, we've seen these titles on foreheads all throughout the book of Revelation, right? Some scholars say that it was very common in the Roman Empire for people to place titles on their foreheads. Some say that they actually wore headbands that would say, I am a follower of the God of whatever it is. Others say they were tattoos, and we could get into all of that. But the dynamic of something being on one's forehead is very common in the Roman Empire. And on her forehead is this phrase, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Just in case we didn't know who she was, her title is written on her forehead. So the nations of the world are drunk or intoxicated on her wine. And look at how the woman is described in verse 6. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. Now, this sounds kind of gross, doesn't it? To be drunk on blood, right? That sounds kind of crazy. But this is a very common image that's used throughout the Old Testament of someone being drunk on something. They're being fueled by something. They're intoxicated by something. They don't know what they're doing because they just have so much of it. That's the dynamic that we see here. And what's she drunk on? She's drunk on the blood of the saints. Now think about the churches in the first century. While we watched a slideshow this morning of those who've served in the armed forces, and last week on All Saints Day, we watched a slideshow of those who have passed away in the last year. We honor those people. I would imagine that in the first century, they would gather together and perhaps read the names of those who had been killed, those who had been martyred, those who had given their lives for the sake of Jesus. And as they gathered together, they remembered those people. And here John sees this prostitute, and she's drunk on the blood of the martyrs. That's what she's all about, taking out the Christians. And look at John's reaction in verse 7. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, why are you astonished? I'll explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, we're going to get an explanation in just a moment of how all of this works out. But when I read that phrase, I was greatly astonished, John says. I'm wondering, why is he astonished? Is he astonished because she's drunk on the blood of the martyrs? That might be one dynamic there. Is he astonished because of her power, of her prestige, of her lavish clothes? Is he astonished because of all the markings that he sees on the beast? I don't know. I wish that question were answered here. Why is John astonished? But he's surprised by what he sees. He can't quite take it all in. But there she is in all of her glory, riding on the beast, drunk on the blood of God's people. And John is assured you'll get an explanation here. John is told by the angel in verse 8, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to his destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because he once was, now is not, and yet will come. Now, you and I are looking at this and going, what's this all about? I see that phrase twice there. Once was, now is not, and will come. What's that all about? Well, scholars have debated this, and there are many different interpretations of what this means. I'll give you a few, but I will say up front, this is hard to decipher. It's hard to understand. And you can go online, and if you Google this, I'm sure you'll get lots of charts, that tell you exactly what this means and what this, when this happened, or what this nation that was the king, and then all of these dynamics. And I'll try not to do that this morning, because what I understand is it's hard to put down. I'll give you a few ideas, though. Some say that it's a parody of the description of the Lamb. What does the Lamb say? The Lamb is who was and who is to come. And they say that the beast is kind of a parody of that. Other scholars have suggested that actually this is talking about a time when the Christians were persecuted. And in particular, if you look at when John is writing this, 30 years prior was the Emperor Nero, whose persecution was incredibly severe. Do you remember that? Or talking about Nero? He was the one who, when the city of Rome burned, he blamed the Christians. And it's told that he even lit the lamppost at night with Christians. He lit them up, put them in oil, and dipped them in oil, and then put them on the lamppost and lit them up. And it was a terrible persecution. And so some scholars say what John is saying is that the beast was, and maybe at this time there's a lull in the persecution. It's diminished a little bit. And then it will come more in the future. And so it's a prediction of what will come. And some people say that's how you need to read this. Others say that it's really just about all of history. The evil one at one point in history overthrew God, right? And he was. And now he's not in charge. But in the end, there will be a time when he will rise up again. I don't know about that, but I think it's hard to understand exactly what John is talking about here. But let's keep reading here. And let's keep going. I'm going to ask Jenna to come back and read verses 9 through 18, and then we'll study this together.
This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they are the beast, will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind, and handing over their royal power to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth.
All right. Now, again, John is writing this when? He's writing it in the first century. And again, there are many different interpretations here on the specifics here. So what I'm going to try to do is say these are things that we don't quite know about, but this is what we do know here in the Scriptures. And as we read this letter, again, we're often left with symbols and images, but here we're given more specifics. In fact, more than we get almost in any other place in Revelation. Look at what it says in verse 9. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Now, if you're in the first century and you read this, you know that Rome was built on 7 hills. So right away you're saying, okay, I get that part. That's Rome. She's sitting on the city of Rome. And then look at verse 10. They are also 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for a little while. Now again, scholars have dug into this, and you can read page after page of interpretations, and they don't all agree. Some say, well, it's really talking about these people over here, and some have made the case that these kings are Roman emperors, and they've kind of outlined it, but it gets a little fuzzy because there's times when there are several emperors in Rome, or at least several that claim to be the emperor, and so you have to kind of work all that out, and scholars have had a hard time fitting all the emperors into the numbers, and we could really get deep here, so I won't do that. Others have said that really these stand for great evil empires throughout all of history, including Egypt and Nineveh and Babylon and Persia and Greece, and Rome being the present kingdom. Still, others have suggested that 7 is a symbolic number representing the whole or the complete Roman Empire. But the important point, those are the things we don't know. The thing that we do know, though, is that the beast is going to destruction. Look what it says in verse 11. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. That's what we do know. Now, the 8th is a part of the 7, and he will take this empire into a new day. And the kingdom of the beast is going to come in power, but in the end it will be destroyed. Now the imagery doesn't end there. Look at verse 12. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. Again, various interpretations about what that verse means. Many scholars say that the 10 kings mentioned here are rulers in different parts of the Roman Empire, and that they are going to kind of have power for a limited period of time. They're all, though, a part of the monster. So are you lost yet? Are you sleeping yet? This gets pretty deep, doesn't it? But the bottom line is this. Look at verse 13. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. And in the end, it says in verse 14, they will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. We know that much, don't we? We know that the beast is going to rise up. He's going to have power for a limited period of time, but then he is going down to destruction. We're also told that the waters here that the prostitute sits on represents peoples, nations, and languages. That would make sense in the first century, wouldn't it? As we think of Rome and we think of its vast, the vast land that it covered. It covered lots of people with different languages and different nations. And then we get to verse 16. I don't know about you, but this is pretty brutal here. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. I don't know about you, but when I read that, I'm like, whoa, this is pretty graphic, isn't it? But let's think of the symbolism here. Let's think of what's going on here. First of all, if you want to go and read Ezekiel chapter 23, you'll see similar imagery there that's described here in Revelation. The beast turns on the prostitute and takes away her adornments. The things that made her attractive. Her purple clothes, her jewels, her golden cup, all of the things that made her attractive. The beast turns on her and takes those things away. Now think about this for just a moment. Think of, again, this image of the prostitute in our world today. What are the things in our world that are glitzy, that grab our attention, that lure us in? And we think these things are wonderful, they're great, but something about it's not quite right. In the end, evil is going to take away all that's attractive. She's going to be left naked. She's going to be left exposed, shameful. It's a wonderful image, isn't it, of what evil does. I think of the way that people in our culture have been lured in to different places. Maybe it was alcohol, or maybe it was drugs. And at first it was all great and wonderful, right? But in time, that evil has turned on that person. And we see them left in destruction. You go to places and you see those whose lives have been racked by the evil that seemed so attractive, but now has eaten them alive, right? That's the dynamic that we see here. I'd also mention that if you want to go and read 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 30 through 37, there are parallels there with Queen Jezebel. Do you remember Queen Jezebel? Ahaz's wife that was the evil queen. When she was done, we have the story of her being thrown from a window and her flesh eaten by dogs. Okay, so that imagery there, kind of gross, but that imagery there is the same sort of imagery that we see in Revelation 16 here, of flesh being eaten. And then the fire is also a symbol of God's judgment often. And so we have fire here in this passage burning up her flesh. And again, I think we need to understand the dynamics of these symbols here, and not try to see this as a literal woman with this happening to her, but an image here that John sees of the beast, of the prostitute, of this evil empire, the things that lure us in, turning on themselves. And then in verse 17 here, we are reminded that God is in control of all of this. It says, "For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish His purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled." And the beast is eating the prostitute, and so that's all part of God's plan, you see. That's what evil does. It turns on itself, but God is behind all of that. And then a final explanation in verse 18. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So we're getting a clue here, aren't we? John's telling us, look, this woman represents a city. What do you think that city might be? Certainly in the first century, the first readers of this would have understood it as Rome. They would have understood that Rome is the beast. Rome is the evil empire that at the time is taking out the Christians. But its power will not last forever. Now, next week we're going to talk about Babylon and this image of Babylon. Babylon's this ancient city. Rome is, in the first century, the current city. For us, it's an ancient city, but for them, it was the current city of power. And we're going to talk about this symbol of Babylon and how it's not limited to ancient Babylon. It's not limited to just Rome. It's really limited, or it's really unlimited. It really includes all of the evil empires and evil systems of our world. And we're going to be talking about that more next week. But as we kind of come to the end of this chapter, I want to just remind you of what fantastic imagery we have in the book of Revelation, right? Sometimes it's hard to understand. And I admit, if you sit down and read this through, you're probably just going to be going, I don't even know what this is saying here, right? I don't know how to interpret this. But as we dig into it together, as we begin to think about it in terms of how the first readers would have understood these words, as we begin to understand what apocalyptic genre is and how these images are communicated, they reveal powerful truths to us, don't they? And just think about the images that we have here. The image of the prostitute and the bride are incredible images, aren't they? They're images that remind us of who God is and what God is doing. And if you think about all the way back in the Garden of Eden, God set up man and woman, and he set up a marriage for them, right? And this image of marriage is then extended to God's relating to us. And we learn toward the end of Revelation that we will be married to God and have that sort of relationship with him. Now think about the difference between a prostitute and marriage, or the prostitute and the bride. The prostitute is the one who has all of the glitzy things that lure us in. It seems pleasurable at the time, but there's a price to pay, right? The bride is long-term. The bride is true intimacy. Prostitute, the bride. Which one do you want? Which one do you want to live in? The world of the prostitute or the world of the bride? What a striking thought, huh? Think about the world in which we live. Think about what God is doing in our world. God is creating a marriage with us, right? He's creating a long-term relationship with us so that we can live in his presence forever. We're going to get to this when we get to the end of Revelation. And let me tell you, it's good stuff. It's exciting stuff. But along the way, there are prostitutes on every corner. And I'm not talking about literal prostitutes. I'm talking about things that stand as a prostitute. What might that be in your life? What might that prostitute be that is pulling you in, that is pulling you away from God, that is seeking to destroy that marriage relationship that you'll have with God? And it seems good, it seems like it's great, it seems like it's going to be the best thing in the world, but it's evil. And one day, it's going to be destroyed, flesh-eaten. But God wants a marriage with you. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm talking in symbolic terms here. God wants that sort of relationship with you. Will we deny the prostitutes of our world in order to celebrate in the marriage feast of the Lamb? That's the question. And again, I'm talking in terms, I'm not saying don't go join a prostitute, literally. I'm saying the prostitutes of the world, these images here, lure us in. What a powerful passage, huh? What a tough passage. Would you agree? Yeah. I promise you, it's going to be worth it in the end if you'll stick with me through the book of Revelation. We're going to walk through all the way to the end. And when we get to the bride, we're going to look back at this chapter, and it's going to have more meaning because we've experienced it. This morning, we want to come to a time when you respond to whatever God might be saying to you this morning. And I'm not sure what that would be. Maybe this morning you find yourself lured in by the things of the world. And you want to break that. You want to say, God, I want to walk with you. I want to be in relationship with you. And maybe this morning there'd be a spiritual commitment that you'd want to make. Maybe you'd want to come and pray at the altar and do that privately. Maybe you'd like to pray for someone who is struggling this morning. Maybe come and pray for them this morning. Maybe you'd like to make a confession of faith, maybe to be baptized or to join this church. Now would be the time that you would do that, and I'll be standing down front. If you brought an offering this morning, you can come and bring that as an act of worship. If you've given online and want to just bring a green card down, just to symbolize the fact that you're giving, not to show off, but to do it as an act of worship. You do that now as God would lead you.